No matter what century is outside the window, no matter what year is on the calendar, humanity still faces a few questions it cannot answer. What is the meaning of life? Do penguins have knees? And can Russia exist without war?
The conversation with Putin was very good and productive. An agreement was reached on the immediate cessation of attacks on energy and infrastructure facilities, with the understanding that we will work swiftly towards a complete ceasefire and the end of this horrific war. Many elements of a peace agreement were discussed, and both Putin and Zelensky want to stop this. The process is already in full motion, hopefully. For the sake of all humanity, we will make it happen.
As for the immediate part, it seems Trump got ahead of himself, because at the very moment of his statement, 35 Shah drones from Russia were in the skies over Ukraine. Hello, my name is Kateryna Soliar and there will be no usual countdown of time, because here, as in a vacuum, only one time is frozen: 24 hours left. Or maybe not. 24 hours have passed since Trump's failure in the negotiation process with Russia. Why do I call it a failure, or a setback, if you prefer? Because, for the first time on behalf of Ukraine, the idea of a ceasefire at sea and in the air, as well as the exchange of all prisoners, was voiced by President Volodymyr Zelensky on March 4. The president's address came at a sensitive moment, just days after a heated confrontation with U.S. President Donald Trump at the White House. On the very day U.S. military aid was halted and just hours before Trump's address to Congress. But U.S. negotiators insisted that the ceasefire be full and comprehensive. Ukraine, of course, agreed. Yet after Trump's talks with Putin, we found ourselves back at square one, a ceasefire at sea and in the air. In other words, Trump and Russia's idea was reduced to nothing. This day could have been the most defining moment in modern history. And in the end,
everyone interpreted yesterday's phone conversation in their own way. Let me remind you that there was a press conference initially planned with Trump himself, where he was supposed to address the press and explain the events that took place. However, instead of Trump personally speaking to the media, his press service took charge. The statement released by the Russians after this phone call, according to many experts and international analysts, was much better written, more detailed, and more carefully structured point by point. It was seen as more thorough and well thought out than expected. It was prepared in advance and appeared quickly. In contrast, the American press service, the White House, didn't even initially post this information on the official website. It only appeared from Trump's spokeswoman on social media platform X, formerly known as Twitter.
And why is that? Because no matter what the Western press writes about Putin wanting to end the war, because it's a massive burden on him, because Russia's economy is stuck on a war footing, because he doesn't want to carry out another mobilization, and so on, I continue to insist, Putin's power will last as long as the war lasts. The only question is, what will end first? Will Putin's rule collapse, leading to the end of the war? Or will the war end, bringing down Putin's rule? Of course, there could have been a third, as yet unrealized scenario, if Trump had offered Putin some kind of incentive. An incentive to stop. And by incentive, I mean one with a negative sign. For example, either you stop the war, or you will no longer be able to transport your oil anywhere by sea. I'll make arrangements with Turkey and Denmark, Trump could have said. And believe me, he could have made that deal. Or, either you stop the war, or we will give Ukraine weapons that the people of Russia have never heard of and never seen before. But Trump didn't say that.
During his entire time in office so far, he has taken exactly one action. He refused to renew the licenses for 12 Russian financial institutions, including banks, clearinghouses, and other entities that handle and process dollar payments for energy resources. And to be fair, that's a pretty significant blow. The logic is quite straightforward. During the Biden administration, financial sanctions were imposed on all Russian financial institutions. However, certain institutions were granted exemptions from these sanctions through special licenses, allowing them to continue operating under specific conditions despite the broader restrictions. Trump chose not to renew those licenses. That was the only move he made during this period that actually escalated the situation. Trump has no intention or desire to fight Putin, not in the literal sense, of course, but rather in a financial sense. He has shown no interest in engaging in economic confrontations or pursuing financial measures against him. What we see instead is that he has entangled himself in trade wars with America's own allies, Canada, the European Union, and China. China may not be a full-fledged ally, but it is at least a trading partner. However, when it comes to Putin, there is a noticeable lack of strong rhetoric and no clear message about what consequences will follow if the war persists. There are no threats of new sanctions, at least not publicly. No threats to provide Ukraine with game-changing weapons. Though, to be fair, the US doesn't have many entirely new types of weapons left to offer. The only real possibilities would be aircraft or long-range missiles, both of which come with serious questions about whether they could actually be used effectively.
We weren't at these negotiations. We can only trust official press statements, and the US and Russia offer contradictory narratives. It almost feels like either the translators didn't translate correctly, or they weren't translating at all. Or maybe they weren't even speaking to each other but to entirely different representatives. Because it resembles a game of broken telephone. Let's break it down step by step. Trump said he and Putin didn't discuss US aid to Ukraine during the call. Yet the Kremlin's statement emphasized that halting military assistance and intelligence sharing was a key condition for a ceasefire. Trump also claimed that a ceasefire would be difficult because Russia has the advantage on the battlefield, so it should be given the opportunity to continue seizing Ukrainian territory. He fabricated a scenario of 2,500 Ukrainian soldiers encircled in Russia's Kursk region, essentially backtracking on his position. Meanwhile, Witkoff announced that on Sunday, March 23, a meeting between Waltz and Rubio and Russian representatives would take place in Jeddah to discuss a ceasefire at sea. Both Witkoff and journalist Sean Hannity discussed the ceasefire as if it had already occurred. Yet at that very moment, despite the Kremlin's statement claiming an order had been given to halt attacks, Russia was already launching new strikes on Ukraine.
After Vladimir Putin's conversation with US President Donald Trump, in which Putin claimed that he had ordered a cessation of strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, the reality turned out to be drastically different. In fact, that very same night, 150 drones were launched, with many of them specifically targeting critical energy facilities. Additionally, there were strikes on transportation networks, and, tragically, 2 hospitals, along with civilian infrastructure, were struck, causing significant damage and loss. Putin's words are completely disconnected from reality. This is why Ukraine urgently needs defensive support, reinforcement of its air defense systems, and increased pressure on Russia, for the sake of security and to save human lives.
145 Shah drones and 6 ballistic missiles that Russia conveniently chose not to mention.
According to the Russian Ministry of Defense, following negotiations between Putin and Trump, the Russian military received an order from the Supreme Commander to halt strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. At that moment, 7 Russian drones targeted Ukrainian energy facilities in Mykolaiv linked to the defense industry. Russia ordered air defense to neutralize them. 6 were shot down by a Pantsir, 1 by an aerospace forces fighter.
In response, Ukraine also demonstrated its openness to dialogue, but unlike Russia, it did not target civilian infrastructure. Instead, it struck a military facility, the Kavkaz Oil Depot, a key hub for exporting Russian oil via the Caspian Pipeline Consortium. As of now, the purpose of the March 23 meeting in Saudi Arabia remains unclear, given that even the first agreement is not being upheld. So what's the point of discussing a second one? Additionally, Witkoff, who was present alongside Vance during Trump's conversation with Putin, dodged the question of whether Russia would pause its rearmament for 30 days, the same condition it is demanding from Ukraine. He simply replied, "The devil is in the details." And that was it. Everything, he said, would be discussed further in Saudi Arabia. The devil truly is in the details. Because when Trump recounted his conversation with Putin, he claimed that the topic of halting US aid to Ukraine never even came up. But in reality, it did.
And what about Putin's non-negotiable demands? According to Kremlin media reports, he insisted on the immediate cessation of all military aid to Ukraine as a prerequisite for this so-called multi-stage agreement.
No, he didn't do that. In fact, we didn't discuss any aid at all. We talked about many things, but aid was not one of them.
And we could believe this, and also what Witkoff said, that he would praise Putin for everything he did during this call to move toward a final peace agreement. Trump couldn't overstate how charming he was during the call. He's a natural leader. And he demonstrated that today. We could believe this, if it weren't for the fact that the Kremlin was the first to make a statement following the Trump-Putin conversation. So, let's read the Kremlin's demands, the very ones that, according to Witkoff, Trump never even raised. The Kremlin demanded a halt to mobilization in Ukraine for a 30-day ceasefire, as well as the complete cessation of military aid and intelligence sharing, as expected. Trump proposed halting strikes on energy infrastructure. Putin agreed to a 30-day pause and, as he claims, gave the military the corresponding order. Meanwhile, Ukrainian monitoring groups were already recording the launch of Shah drones at that very moment. The repeated claim about the need to address the root causes of the crisis and Russia's legitimate security interests was also voiced by the Kremlin. Putin also announced a prisoner exchange, which took place 175 for 175. Negotiations will take place on security initiatives for Black Sea shipping. Export negotiation groups will be established between Russia and the US, and hockey matches between NHL and KHL players will be organized.
Donald Trump supported Putin's idea to organize hockey matches in the US and Russia between Russian and American players from the NHL and KHL.
At least they agreed on something. It seems they're lacking spectacles. Meanwhile, we're lacking the US resolve to end the war. Because, as the president said, Putin's words that he orders not to hit the energy sector are not enough, no matter how sincerely Witkoff believes in it. An example is yesterday's strike, including on energy infrastructure. Putin said he gave the order. Then there were 145 Shah drones and 6 missiles. Strikes across 6 regions, 21 residential buildings. That's the price of Putin's words. We don't want the price to rise due to Trump's words. Multiplying by 0 always results in 0. According to Zelensky, Putin is now demanding that the US recognize Crimea and other occupied territories as part of Russia, which are red lines for Ukraine.
When it comes to the territories, this is likely to be one of the most sensitive, complicated, and challenging issues that will arise in the upcoming negotiations. The question of territorial disputes will undoubtedly require careful and delicate handling, as it involves deeply rooted concerns and conflicting interests that will not be easily resolved. The first step, however, is still the unconditional ceasefire. Even if we need to go through certain stages, such as silence in the sky, silence at sea, it will eventually lead to silence along the entire front. These are the right steps if we truly want to end the war with a just peace. After that, we will move on to other issues, among which I'm sure territorial questions will be raised. For us, the red line is the recognition of Ukrainian territories that are temporarily occupied as part of Russia. We will not agree to that.
There are other red lines as well. Russia must never have any influence on the independence of Ukrainians. I don't want to discuss with them what our army should look like. This is an element of our independence. And I don't want to discuss with them our accession to the European Union, which is our economic guarantee. Or, as the president said, we are not a dish on the table.
I don't want us to be on Putin's menu. Do you understand? We are not a salad or compote for this person, regardless of his appetite. We see what he is like.
Here, I think it's worth reminding what this quote from the president referred to.
Medvedev, the former prime minister and Putin's predecessor in the presidential chair, wrote, if I'm not mistaken, on Twitter or perhaps some other platform, that there are only 2 world dining rooms, referring to Russia and the US, and for lunch, they supposedly serve Brussels sprouts, British fish and chips with French roosters, and, naturally, chicken Kiev, as if these are the only symbolic dishes that truly represent the global culinary landscape. Everything else, he says, all the other countries, are merely served as a side dish to these two great world powers, Russia and the US, having little significance in comparison to the dominant influence on the global stage. He wrote this after yesterday's phone conversation between Putin and Trump. And at the same time, they reminded him, well, at least I'll make sure to remind him right away, that the story about Chicken Kyiv first made its way into the political lexicon after George Bush Sr. visited Kyiv in 1991. This visit took place just 3 weeks before Ukraine declared its independence, during a time when the Soviet Union was still intact, marking a pivotal moment in both Ukraine's history and international relations. He first had a meeting in Moscow with Gorbachev, during which Gorbachev discussed the challenges of handling and developing the Soviet Union in its current state. Afterward, he traveled to Kyiv, where he spoke at the Verkhovna Rada, addressing the issue of Ukrainian nationalism, which he described as a form of suicidal nationalism, a viewpoint that sparked significant controversy at the time. This phrase was first used to suggest that Ukraine should remain a part of the Soviet Union. It was in this context that journalists at the New York Times first referred to his speech as Chicken Kyiv. Now, the word chicken in English can be used as a slang term to refer to a coward, so as a result, the speech was widely described as a cowardly speech when it was given in Kyiv, further fueling the controversy surrounding it. The speech was described as cowardly in Kyiv, and just 3 weeks later, the Soviet Union collapsed, leading to Ukraine's independence. I would also relate Medvedev's post about Chicken Kyiv and about eating to similar statements made in the past. He essentially talked about the collapse of the Soviet Union. We are, of course, thankful for everything he did for Ukraine. I believe that Russian leaders today are playing with the LNR, Luhansk People's Republic. But the collapse of Russia could happen very suddenly, even for Medvedev and Putin.
Can anyone influence the interests of Ukrainians? It's simple. Consider the issue of elections. The Western press frequently covers the elections. It's actively reporting that Trump's son, his son-in-law Tucker Carlson, and even Steve Witkoff, the only official person in this group, were negotiating with Poroshenko and Tymoshenko. This is reported by Politico. A Republican foreign policy expert suggests influencing Zelensky to make him more compliant, as he is seen as an obstacle. You involve his political opponents and show him that there are other Ukrainian partners and options in Washington. But I think part of Trump's world is mistaken in believing that they can simply appoint someone in Ukraine as their partner and somehow achieve electoral success in the future, regardless of when the elections take place, the expert added. This assumption overlooks the complexity of the situation and the broader geopolitical dynamics at play. This is a huge lack of understanding of Ukraine, because who governs Ukraine is solely decided by the Ukrainian people. And in this context, a logical question to the president is whether he feels that the United States has turned away from Ukraine.
Ukraine is very vulnerable if America is not our strategic partner and turns its back on us. And I would prefer not to talk about that. We've had signs or steps showing this danger, such as the temporary suspension of aid. I am deeply grateful to the President and his team for restoring everything. For us, this is especially important because it demonstrates our strong, close relationship, our shared strategic vision for the future, and a secure future for the people of Ukraine. I truly believe that this bond and commitment will not change. As for the unconditional ceasefire, we responded immediately because we genuinely want to bring an end to the war. And we fully understand that, unfortunately, the Russians have no interest in ending it. It's incredibly important for me to see transparent and clear steps being taken by Ukraine and its diplomacy, so that President Trump, his team, and most importantly, the people of America, can truly understand and see that, for us, achieving a peaceful resolution to this war is not just a priority but the most crucial goal that we are committed to. It is important for us to end this war as quick as possible.
These comments were made by the President of Ukraine alongside the President of Finland, who, through the lens of its own history, has much to share with Ukraine. In particular, the President of Finland, Alexander Stubb, reminded us of what happened in 1940.
In 1940, Finland was forced to give up a significant portion of its territory to Russia in order to ensure its survival during that difficult period. Does this suggest that this is a path Ukraine might consider at this moment, or should we completely dismiss it as an option moving forward?
The foundation of statehood typically rests on three essential principles: independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, which are crucial for the stability and recognition of any nation. In 1944, Finland, under the harsh conditions of the Stalinist peace, lost two of these fundamental principles, significantly altering its position and sovereignty in the region. We managed to preserve our independence, and it was probably the only neighboring Soviet country to successfully do so, but in the process, we lost around 10% of our territory, which was a significant blow to our national integrity and security. And I always emphasize that these are the territories where my grandmothers, grandfathers, and father were born. And if Ukraine faces such a question, my answer is absolutely no. We are continuously working on securing Ukraine's independence, protecting our sovereign rights, advancing our path toward Europe and the West, and ensuring the preservation of our territorial integrity, all of which are vital to our future and stability. This is why we are here. This is why diplomacy continues. And this is why it is such an important moment in international relations and international history.
Finland's example surely is not unique. History shows many instances where courage, resilience, and self-sacrifice result in a moral victory, proving true strength lies in enduring hardship and staying true to values. Sometimes, a moral victory is associated with more tragic precedents than Finland's, such as the famous Battle of Thermopylae, considered the moral victory of the Spartans. The defense of the Alamo is regarded as the moral victory of Texas. And the Warsaw Uprising of 1944 is seen as the moral victory of the Poles. For us, of course, it is still too early to talk about victory. It is even too early to talk about establishing a ceasefire, because Russia immediately violates all agreements. But it is definitely not too early to say that in 3 years we have achieved the most important thing. We have managed to save Ukraine from everyone who didn't believe in us and who wanted to swallow us whole. We continue to stand, we continue our fight. So, have faith in the armed forces, support the Ukrainian military with donations, and we'll see you in 24 hours, a time that will undoubtedly come, bringing us closer to our goal.